The Davenport estate rose above the Kentucky hills, like a monument carved out of pride itself, its white columns gleaming in the sun, its manicured lawns trimmed as if no blade of grass was allowed to grow without permission. From the outside, it was the house of a man who believed in order, in discipline, in the stern weight of law. Judge William Davenport had built it in 1829 as both home and testament to his standing, a beacon of civility in a young state still marked by violence and hunger for land. People who passed along the road saw the grand windows and the American flag flying proudly and said it was a place where justice lived. But the truth was that the foundations of this house were not cement and stone. They were secrecy and silence, pressed so deep into the earth that not even the gossip of neighbors could unearth them. Beneath the polished floors and grand staircase, beneath the dining halls where political allies were entertained and where silver shone beneath candlelight, there lay a cellar. It was not the kind of cellar where food was stored or wine was aged. It was colder, hungrier, and it demanded to be fed in a way no hearth upstairs ever did. The cellar was narrow, built deeper than necessary, its stones damp with the breath of earth. It was designed to conceal sound, to choke it before it could rise to the ears of those who might wander too close. The judge had overseen its construction himself, demanding walls thicker than customary, demanding layers of timber set into the stone like ribs meant to muffle the life inside. To the workers he had said only that he wanted strength, durability, safety for his valuables. But what he stored there could not be spoken of in daylight. Judge William Davenport was admired as a man who brought order to chaos, a figure who punished thieves and murderers, who stood against lawlessness in a growing nation. His words carried weight in court, his judgments spoken as if God himself guided the hammer of his gavel. Yet when he returned each evening to the house on the hill, that mask of justice slipped. He was a man who believed in a deeper order, one no law dared to name. He saw flaws in people not as weaknesses but as stains, marks that had to be erased, controlled, or hidden. And what he could not cleanse in public court, he controlled in private under his own roof. It began with his own family. The Davenports had children, some shown to the world in polished portraits, others who were not mentioned at all. Those who were pale, fragile, or marked by birth defects never left the cellar once they were carried inside. Neighbors asked where the infants had gone, and the judge would speak of fevers, of smallpox, of death that came too easily in those days. No one questioned him, for sickness was common, graves were plenty, and few wished to probe the private grief of a powerful man. Yet there were no graves for those children, only the cellar. The cellar grew into a hidden heart for the family, and in it William Davenport shaped not just a chamber but a philosophy. He believed weakness was contagious, that it could taint the line of his blood and drag his name into ruin. Down in the dark, he could rid himself of that weakness, not with mercy but with method. Each stone and beam pressed into place was another layer of his thinking, another seal against a truth too shameful to exist in daylight. The cellar became a living vault where screams were absorbed into stone and silence was preserved like a sacred vow. Those who entered never returned, yet the judge moved through his days above ground without suspicion. He smiled at church, greeted neighbors, lectured on law and virtue. He was a man who seemed carved out of discipline itself, yet his calmness only deepened the horror. It was not rage that drove him, not sudden madness or loss of control. It was order, pure and deliberate. Each act below was chosen with care, each silence cultivated. He was not hiding a crime in his cellar, he was cultivating a legacy of control. And so the house on the hill stood tall, its columns proud, its windows bright, while beneath, the true foundation sank deeper into the earth with each passing year. The cellar waited, heavy with secrets, silent in its hunger. What lived within those walls was not meant to be spoken. It was meant to be buried alive. To the world outside the white columns of the Davenport home, the family appeared flawless. Judge William Davenport stood at the center of Kentucky's political circles, a man admired for his correspondence with governors and even boasting letters exchanged with President Andrew Jackson. His family was spoken of with respect, their dinners attended by men of influence, their children described as fine examples of refinement. Appearances were curated like paintings, polished and displayed only when they were pleasing to the eye. What the world did not see were the empty chairs. The names never entered into the family Bible, the children who were born and disappeared before a portrait could be commissioned. William Davenport had convinced himself that he was not erasing life but protecting legacy. To him, weakness in the bloodline was not only shame, but a form of contagion. A sick child, a deformed infant, or even one with a mind too quiet was not a soul to be nurtured but a stain that could spread. These children were never shown in public. They were lifted from cribs in the dead of night and taken down to the cellar where air was thin and the stone walls caught the sound of their first and last cries. The family justified it as mercy, telling themselves these children were unfit for the world, that their suffering was brief, and that purity was preserved. But their mercy was not swift. It was deliberate, drawn out, and it became its own tradition. The first deaths were crude, infants swaddled and placed in wooden chests, the lids closed tight while the family prayed above. The sound of muffled cries was taken as confirmation that weakness was being cleansed. But soon such simplicity did not satisfy William. He began designing methods that made the act ritualistic. Infants were submerged into clay basins filled with rainwater drawn from the house roof, the family surrounding the basin and reciting psalms as if baptizing the child. But the baptism never ended. Tiny lungs filled, flailed, then stilled, and the silence was treated as holy. Each time the judge recorded it as a natural loss in his private journals, adding dates as if these deaths were merely household accounts. For those who survived infancy but showed what he called defects of spirit, children who stuttered, who feared shadows, who failed to learn their letters, different methods were chosen. They were not killed at once but conditioned, tested, stripped of what little innocence they had. A child with a limp was forced to stand for hours until his legs gave way, collapsing over and over until the breath left him. A girl born with crossed eyes was locked in the cellar's darkness for days, fed scraps through the bars of a small wooden crate, her vision failing further until she wasted away. To William, this was not cruelty. It was law. The weak were not to be allowed into the world's order. The surviving children, the ones considered strong enough, learned early to fear the cellar. They were paraded before neighbors in their best clothes, taught to speak with calm voices and steady eyes. But behind those voices was a terror that had shaped them since birth. They knew that any sign of weakness could mean the cellar would claim them too. This fear bound them tighter to their father's will than love ever could. They became actors in a play of perfection, smiling at church, bowing before guests, pretending they did not hear the faint cries that sometimes rose through the floorboards in the night. As years passed, the killings grew more methodical. William refined them into rituals that he believed echoed the order of nature. He spoke often of bloodlines, of heritage, of the divine right of strength to endure. He told himself that he was protecting his name, guarding society from decay. And the more he believed it, the easier it became to justify. In his mind, he was no murderer, but a judge even in his own house, ensuring justice not in the courts but in the blood that would survive him. The Davenports became symbols of civility, but beneath the facade, their wealth was built on sacrifices no one dared to speak of. Servants whispered, Neighbors wondered at the quiet burials that never took place, but no one asked. The family's influence was shield enough, their friendships with powerful men a wall that kept questions at bay. In Kentucky, where law was still shaping itself, no one wished to accuse a judge of burying children in his own cellar. And so the myth of the perfect Davenport family was born, bright on the surface, but beneath, sealed in stone and silence, the bloodline was pruned with hands that claimed to serve order. The cellar was not only storage. It was a womb for the family's darkness, a place where innocence was judged, condemned, and erased. The cellar had always been more than stone and timber. From its first design, it was meant to be a space where the world's rules dissolved, where silence became law and cruelty became ritual. It stretched deeper than most, its walls sweating with dampness, the air heavy with mildew and iron. But in the hands of the Davenport family, it grew into something more than a cellar. It became a chamber of transformation, a place where innocence was dismantled and remade into silence. Here, the illusion of the family's purity was preserved not by forgetting, but by carefully documenting each child's descent into suffering. The walls were not bare. They bore shelves stacked with crude medical tools, bone saws, hooks, clamps, and syringes filled with mixtures no physician would ever admit to using. Glass jars lined the corners, cloudy from age, inside them organs suspended in liquid, some so small they could only have come from infants. These were not kept as trophies but as records, as evidence that the family's order was thorough, exact, and unbroken. The cellar was also furnished with devices that resembled furniture at first glance, a table of polished oak with leather straps at its edges, a chair with holes drilled through the back, and armrests for ropes to bind struggling bodies. They were crafted to appear ordinary, yet their purpose was anything but. It was here that William Davenport's eldest son, Charles, discovered his fascination. Unlike his father, whose violence was cloaked in the language of law and purity, Charles craved precision. He had read of physicians in Europe who used the body as a text to be studied, and he saw in the cellar a chance to create his own form of science. The children brought down here were not simply hidden or silenced. They became experiments, each death not an end but a step toward refinement. Charles believed he was studying the threshold between life and death, between weakness and endurance. And so his cruelty was methodical, rehearsed and expanded with each attempt. Slow starvation became his first design. He discovered that if a child was deprived of food but still given small portions tainted with substances, grains mixed with ground roots, milk stirred with extracts of bitter herbs, the body did not simply weaken. It twisted against itself. Muscles contracted in spasms, jaws locked tight. Hallucinations overtook the mind. Children fed in this way lasted weeks, sometimes longer, their cries shifting into laughter, their bodies jerking with seizures until the exhaustion claimed them. To Charles, this was evidence of resilience, proof that weakness could be dragged out and dissected before it perished. He recorded each detail in notebooks, timing the spasms, noting the change in breathing the moment the body surrendered. Discipline blurred into ritual. The cellar was not only a chamber of torment but also of observation. Charles would sit in silence, candlelight flickering across his pale face, watching the children writhe in their corners. He taught himself patience, waiting for hours as the body unraveled. To him, suffering was not waste. It was data, a kind of language written in trembling limbs and hollow eyes. The cellar became his classroom. Each death a lesson, each experiment another layer of mastery. For the family, these rituals became almost ordinary. William continued to oversee the philosophy, justifying every act as necessary for preserving the bloodline. The other children, those deemed strong enough to survive above ground, were sometimes brought down to watch. It was not enough to fear the cellar. They had to understand it, to know that perfection demanded sacrifice. They stood trembling against the damp stone walls, watching siblings or cousins collapse under the weight of slow torment, knowing that one misplaced word, one weakness revealed, might condemn them to the same fate. Their childhoods ended at the threshold of that cellar door, their minds scarred before they even learned what love was. Charles grew colder with each experiment. The jars of organs multiplied, the notebooks filled, and the cellar grew heavier with silence. The deaths were not quick, nor were they chaotic. They were paced, deliberate, like steps in a prayer. Food became poison, drink became a slow choke, the body became a vessel to be tested until it failed. Charles convinced himself that this was his inheritance, his duty to refine what his father had begun. If William was the judge, Charles was the executioner-scientist, binding the two roles into a single identity. The house above remained bright, filled with laughter during gatherings. Music played in the parlor, the family praised as models of civility. Yet each note of music, each toast of wine was balanced on the silence below, where a child's last breath was stolen not by accident but by design. The cellar's darkness was not an absence of light, but a presence, thick and consuming, shaping the family's legacy one death at a time. By the time the first journals were full, the cellar was no longer simply a hiding place. It had become the Davenport laboratory, a shrine of cruelty masked as discipline. Each victim was reduced to silence, each method perfected through repetition. And as Charles closed another jar, as he labeled another notebook page with dates and times, he did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a craftsman of purity, an apprentice of order. The cellar was his inheritance, and in his hands it had begun to breathe. As the Davenport name spread farther across Kentucky, the family's reputation solidified as one of order, wealth, and civility. The judge was invited to state functions, his words trusted in matters of law. His house described as a temple of good breeding and discipline. Yet the higher the family climbed in public, the more they demanded control in private. Their fear was not of poverty or scandal, but of weakness in the bloodline being seen, spoken of, or remembered. Silence became their obsession, not only as secrecy but as ritual, a force that had to be shaped into the flesh of those born into the cellar's darkness. The cellar was no longer a place of crude experiments alone. It became a chapel of silence, where punishments were transformed into ceremonies. Children too frail, too timid, or simply too unwanted were dragged into rituals that were designed not just to kill but to erase their ability to speak or be heard. Wax, heated until it hissed and bubbled, was poured into their ears while their small bodies writhed against restraints. The wax hardened, sealing them into deafness, trapping them in an eternal stillness where cries for help could never again be shaped into sound. Their silence was considered holy, a sign that their flawed voices had been surrendered to order. But the family did not stop with ears. The tongue was the next target. A heated iron, thin and sharp, was pressed against the soft flesh until it scarred, swelling into a useless lump that could no longer form words. These mutilations were not performed in haste or frenzy, but with the calm precision of a ritual. Candles were lit, psalms recited, and the children forced to kneel or be held down as the iron did its work. Their screams were muffled by cloth, but even when they broke through, they were regarded as nothing more than impurities leaving the body. The family told themselves that these voices, once corrupted, were being purified by fire. The acts were performed on Sundays most often, just as neighbors filled church pews and hymns rang through the countryside. Inside the Davenport cellar, hymns were recited too, but twisted into a liturgy of cruelty. The judge stood over each ceremony with his calm authority, while Charles noted the effects with his cold fascination. The cellar echoed not with the chaos of murder, but with the order of ritual, a strange mockery of worship where mutilation replaced prayer. Each child silenced became another step toward what the family believed was purification of their lineage. Some children survived these rituals, left deaf and tongueless, crawling in corners, their minds collapsing under the weight of their mutilation. They became living reminders to the other children of what awaited if they faltered. The survivors were kept for months, sometimes years, until their frail bodies wasted away, their silence haunting the cellar more deeply than cries ever could. They were not simply discarded corpses, but symbols, walking proof of the family's creed. Weakness must be broken into silence before it can be erased. The psychological toll was deliberate. For the children who lived above ground, the ones considered strong enough to show in public, the rituals were whispered of, but never fully explained. They were taken down sometimes, forced to watch their weaker siblings undergo the mutilations, taught that silence was not just expected, but demanded. Their terror bound them to obedience. Every smile at dinner, every proper bow before guests, was shaped not by love or respect, but by the memory of wax burning into flesh and tongue silenced by iron. The cellar became not only a chamber of suffering, but a classroom, where obedience was etched into the soul through the suffering of others. For William Davenport, the rituals grew into a philosophy that guided him as much as any legal code. He believed silence was not merely absence of noise, but the highest form of order. A child stripped of voice or hearing could not challenge authority, could not shame the family, could not contaminate the bloodline with weakness spoken aloud. Each ritual was written in his journals with the same tone he used to record his court rulings. Cold, final, without remorse. To him, the mutilations were judgments, carried out not in anger but in the service of legacy. Charles, however, saw more. For him, silence was a tool of study. He noted how long children lived after their tongues were destroyed, how they adapted to deafness, how madness grew in the absence of sound. He watched as survivors began to claw at themselves, tearing skin and hair in desperation to feel something that the silence would not take. These observations filled his notebooks, and in his twisted mind, each suffering body was a page in a textbook, a lesson in human frailty. And so silence deepened in the cellar. It was not the natural silence of stone or soil, but a constructed one imposed by cruelty, engineered into flesh and bone. The more the family demanded silence, the more the cellar fed on it, until the very air felt weighted with unspoken screams. Above, the Davenport family greeted their guests with polished smiles, the music of the parlor filling the halls. Below, the cellar remained a chapel of silence, where children were mutilated in the name of purity, and where the family's faith in order was fed by the methodical destruction of voices never meant to be heard. In 1834, the Davenport family's rituals, already refined into patterns of silence and starvation, found a new hand to guide them. Dr. Erasmus Harlan arrived at the estate under the guise of friendship, a physician whose reputation carried weight across the young nation. He was a man of letters, his correspondence reaching as far as European medical societies that prided themselves on dissecting the boundaries of human endurance. Harlan wore the mask of science with ease, speaking of anatomy, circulation, and cures. Yet beneath his careful language lived a darker fascination. He sought not to heal but to test, to peel away the fragile layers of the human mind and body to reveal what lay beneath. When William Davenport opened his cellar to him, the doctor did not recoil. He leaned forward. The cellar was no longer strange to the family, but in Harlan's eyes it became a laboratory. His notes, kept hidden in leather-bound journals, described what he found there with clinical detail. Children bound on wooden tables, wrists tied with rope, skin pale and thin from weeks of deprivation. He introduced what he called controlled bloodletting, a practice once thought to cure fevers, but here twisted into a method of gradual weakening. Veins were opened with small incisions, just enough to drain strength but not enough to end life. The children grew dizzy, their eyes clouded, their limbs heavy. Harlan observed with precision, measuring how long it took before consciousness faded, how often it returned, how the body fought against its own loss. To him, each gasp was a data point, each collapse a discovery, but blood was only the beginning. Harlan's fascination reached beyond the body into the mind. He spoke of sensory deprivation, of stripping the human experience down to its barest elements to study what visions or madness would arise. And so the cellar became darker still. Eyelids were sewn shut with coarse thread, denying children the relief of light. Bound and blind, they were left in corners for days, their hallucinations spilling into screams that shook the stone walls. Harlan recorded these cries with clinical detachment, noting how quickly the mind dissolved without sight, how easily fear overtook the imagination when the world was reduced to blackness. He called it research. The family called it purification. For the children, it was a descent into madness. The deaths that followed were not sudden. They dragged on with an almost deliberate cruelty, the body breaking piece by piece while Harlan observed the unraveling. One boy, barely 10 years old, was kept blindfolded and bloodlet for weeks until his body wasted into a husk. His last days were spent muttering to himself, whispering of shapes in the darkness that clawed at him, even as his tongue cracked with thirst. Harlan's notes described it clinically. Subject expired after prolonged visual deprivation and circulatory depletion. The mind collapsed before the body. To him, the boy was not a child, but a subject, a line of study closed. To the Davenports, his death was evidence that weakness had been judged and erased. Harlan's presence gave the family something new: legitimacy. To neighbors, the doctor was a man of medicine, trusted to cure and to comfort. His friendship with the judge shielded questions, his reputation making suspicion seem unthinkable. When whispers spread of children disappearing within the estate, Harlan's visits became proof that nothing sinister could be happening. After all, what family would invite a physician of standing into their home if they had something to hide? Respectability became the mask that silence could not provide, and behind it the cellar deepened into a place where cruelty was mistaken for science. The psychological toll grew heavier. For Charles Davenport, Harlan was a revelation. Where his father provided law and order, the doctor provided method and language. Charles absorbed each lesson, watching with fascination as Harlan measured suffering not as sin but as data. To him, the experiments were no longer punishments. They were studies, controlled and purposeful. His notebooks filled faster, his handwriting frantic, as if the cellar itself demanded every detail be preserved. What once had been ritual cruelty became, in Charles's mind, the foundation of discovery. The children above ground lived in greater fear than ever. They saw Harlan's carriage arrive, heard his footsteps echo through the house, and knew that someone would not return. They were taught to respect him, to bow their heads when he passed, even as their hearts raced with the knowledge of what his presence meant. The cellar became a wordless threat, and the doctor its priest, cloaked not in blood but in the clean white of medicine. The silence that once consumed the cellar now stretched through the halls of the house, woven into every heartbeat, every hushed glance. And so the Davenport cellar entered a new stage. It was no longer merely a family's chamber of secrecy. With Harlan's hand, it became something larger, something closer to a hidden institution of suffering. Behind closed doors, science and cruelty fused into one, justified by respectability, protected by silence. Each child who descended into its dark corridors became both victim and experiment, their agony preserved not in memory but in the cold pages of journals locked away. And above, the family continued to smile, to entertain, to walk among neighbors as if the cellar did not exist, as if silence alone could hide the cries that no stone could truly contain. Charles Davenport's cruelty reached its most chilling form when he conceived of a device that merged punishment with reflection. He had grown restless with bloodletting and mutilations, restless with silence alone. He wanted suffering that did not simply destroy but dismantled the spirit piece by piece, forcing the victim to witness their own unraveling. From this hunger came the chamber of glass, a room built not to contain the children but to turn their own bodies into instruments of torment. The chamber was lined with mirrors, not the polished kind found in parlors, but warped sheets of glass pressed against the walls at uneven angles. Their surfaces were jagged and distorted, reshaping faces into grotesque masks, stretching limbs into twisted parodies of form. A child locked inside could not see themselves as they were, but only as something monstrous, their innocence reflected back as corruption. Charles designed it this way deliberately, believing that true punishment was not simply hunger or pain, but the destruction of self-image, the forcing of the weak to despise their own existence. The victims were stripped of clothing and left naked, vulnerable to the cold stone floor and the endless reflections. Food was rationed in tiny portions, often spoiled, sometimes laced with herbs that bloated the stomach but gave no strength. Starvation stretched across weeks, the body shrinking, skin clinging tighter to bone, while the mirrors showed only a warped corpse that was still breathing. Some children began clawing at their own flesh, desperate to scrape away the image of the monster staring back. Others pulled out their hair in clumps, leaving bald patches across their heads, convinced the twisted faces in the glass were demons crawling from their scalp. Charles watched with fascination through a small hatch in the wall. He described in his notebooks how the children turned against themselves, how self-hatred bloomed like infection. Their cries grew less about hunger and more about the faces in the mirrors, the endless repetition of their own bodies decaying. The chamber required no lash, no iron, no fire. It demanded only time and the cruelty of reflection. To Charles, it was perfect because it forced the victim to participate in their own torment, to destroy themselves long before death arrived. Some of the deaths were slow and methodical, starvation grinding down the last will to move, leaving only a faint shadow pressed against the mirrored walls. Others ended violently, children breaking their fingernails against the glass, cutting their skin on the edges, smearing the mirrors with blood in attempts to blot out the distorted faces staring back. Charles recorded each act as if it were evidence of divine judgment, as if the chamber itself revealed a hidden truth, that the weak, when confronted with their reflection, would consume themselves. The family turned the chamber into ritual. William Davenport, still cloaked in his belief in law and order, began to see the mirrored deaths as a reflection of God's final judgment. He described the chamber as a rehearsal for the soul's confrontation with eternity, where the sinner was forced to face their corrupted image. Sunday nights were chosen for these rituals, aligning them with the day neighbors filled church pews. While hymns rang outside, the chamber filled with the sounds of children screaming at their own warped faces, clawing the floor, whispering prayers to glass that gave no mercy. The psychological toll spread beyond the victims. The children of the family who remained upstairs were sometimes ordered to stand at the hatch and look inside. They were told this was a lesson, a vision of what awaited if they faltered, if they failed to uphold strength and purity. Their young minds carried the images of brothers and cousins tearing their own skin, begging the mirrors for relief, with nowhere to turn but deeper obedience. Fear became their only guide. Love did not shape them, nor hope, but terror carved into their memories like scripture. Charles perfected his chamber, replacing glass when it cracked, altering the angles to produce more grotesque shapes. He experimented with lighting, sometimes flooding the chamber with candlelight to intensify the distortions, other times plunging it into near darkness where only faint glimmers of reflection haunted the child's vision. He was no longer satisfied with simple suffering. He wanted to craft hallucinations, to bend reality itself into a weapon that turned innocence into madness. The deaths inside the chamber were methodical, and they were devastating. Each one left behind a body wasted not only by hunger but by hatred of itself, as though the child had died believing they were less than human. For Charles, this was proof that his invention had succeeded, that he had created not just a tool of punishment, but a mirror of truth. To William, it was confirmation that the weak had been judged and condemned. To the family, it was another tradition woven into their legacy. And so the chamber remained, a glass shrine hidden beneath a house of white columns, where children were stripped of more than breath. They were stripped of the belief that they had ever been worthy of life. Above, the music of the parlor continued, laughter filling the halls, while below, the chamber swallowed another soul into its warped silence. The Davenport cellar did not remain the domain of Judge William and his son Charles alone. As years wore on, the family understood that cruelty had to be taught, passed down as inheritance like land, wealth, or name. What began as secrecy became tradition, and tradition demanded participation. New heirs, children born into privilege, were no longer spared from the rituals. They were not locked away as victims but brought into the cellar as apprentices, forced to learn that suffering was their true legacy. The youngest heirs were led down the narrow stairwell before they could even grasp the meaning of what they saw. At first they stood trembling in corners, covering their ears as siblings screamed. But soon trembling was no longer allowed. Their hands were placed on levers, on straps, on cranks, and they were told they were part of something larger than themselves. The cellar became a school where cruelty was not only witnessed but practiced, each small task binding them deeper into the family's silence. The children did not choose to participate. They were told that participation proved their strength, and refusal would place them among the weak. Charles, now hardened by years of his father's philosophy and his own obsession, introduced what he called trials of endurance. Gas chambers were built, crude but effective, sealed rooms where coal fumes were funneled in through pipes. It was the youngest heirs who were made to turn the iron cranks that released the fumes, their small hands gripping the cold metal, their faces tight with fear. At first they sobbed as they heard their brothers or cousins cough and collapse inside. But the family demanded stillness. They were told to watch until silence came, and once it did, they were praised for their obedience. The act of killing was transformed into duty. The children taught that their hands had upheld purity by removing weakness. The trials became ritualized into games. The most horrific was called trial by air. Two children would be placed together in a sealed space. One allowed access to a narrow pipe of fresh air while the other was denied. The family observed from outside, timing how long the weaker child lasted before collapsing. To them it was not murder but divine selection, proof that God himself chose who was fit to live. When one child emerged gasping, trembling, and alive, the family applauded as though witnessing victory. The dead child was not mourned. They were recorded in journals as expunged, their silence marked as necessary. These games stripped innocence away from those who survived. The children who lived through trial by air did not walk out as victors but as hollowed shells, haunted by the knowledge that their survival had come at the cost of their kin. Some wept in corners at night, whispering apologies into the dark. Others grew numb, learning to bury compassion beneath obedience. Either way, they were changed forever, bound to the cellar not just by fear but by guilt, each one complicit in the cruelty that defined their family name. William Davenport saw this inheritance as justice fulfilled. His own hands were growing frail, but to him it did not matter. His children and grandchildren were carrying forward the order he had built. He believed cruelty was not a weakness but a strength, one that could be taught, repeated, and perfected. When he looked upon the heirs turning the cranks or watching trial by air, he saw not children but judges in training, each one capable of enforcing the silent law that had shaped his legacy. Charles, more fanatical than his father, took it further. He told the heirs that every act of cruelty was not only duty but devotion, that each death was a sacrifice proving their loyalty to blood and name. He praised those who did not flinch, who carried out their tasks with steady hands, and he punished those who faltered by threatening to place them in the chamber themselves. Fear and pride became indistinguishable, weaving together into chains that bound the next generation to the cellar's darkness. The psychological toll deepened with each ritual. Children too young to understand death were made executioners before they understood the meaning of life. Their laughter was replaced by silence, their eyes dulled by the weight of what they had done. Some broke, retreating into madness, whispering to the walls as though the cries of their victims still echoed there. Others hardened, becoming mirrors of Charles, convinced that their cruelty was sacred. In either case, innocence did not survive. The cellar consumed it, passing cruelty down like inheritance, ensuring no generation could escape. And so the Davenport family grew not only in wealth and power, but in darkness. What had begun as the judge's secret philosophy evolved into ritualized games of death, teaching children that suffocating their kin was proof of purity, that survival was divine will. The cellar no longer belonged to a single generation. It had become the family's legacy, carved into blood and bone, an inheritance of cruelty that would endure long after the first stones were laid. Above ground, the house remained bright, its columns unyielding, its family admired. But below, the air grew heavier with each generation, filled with the suffocated silence of children who had been sacrificed not for sin, but for tradition. Eleanor Davenport was born different. The family knew it from her first cry, her upper lip split, her palate incomplete. To William Davenport, this was not a child, but a flaw written across the flesh, a mark that betrayed his belief in purity. For weeks she was hidden in shadow, cradled only by servants who were instructed never to speak her name outside the walls. No portrait was made, no entry inked in the family Bible. She was alive, but to the world she did not exist. In the halls above, her siblings learned to avoid mentioning her, for to speak of Eleanor was to invite their father's wrath. Yet in the silence of the cellar, she became an obsession. William believed that Eleanor's face was a curse, a wound in his bloodline that could not be allowed to surface. But unlike the children who had been erased quickly through suffocation or starvation, Eleanor's difference stirred something deeper in him. He did not see her as weak in body but corrupted in spirit, and he became convinced that only a ritual of cleansing could erase the shame she carried. He began to treat her not only as an unworthy child but as a symbol of everything that threatened his order. Eleanor grew in the cellar, pale from the lack of sunlight, her voice muffled by the cleft that split her words into broken echoes. She clutched at scraps of cloth for comfort, scratching marks into the stone walls to count the days. She did not know love, only the sharp cold of neglect and the constant shadow of being watched. Charles observed her with fascination, scribbling notes about her difficulties in speech, about the way she struggled to swallow food, about the sadness in her eyes. To him she was another study, a subject to be recorded. To William she was an impurity that demanded ritual erasure. The method he devised was unlike anything the cellar had seen before. He had a barrel of iron prepared, its interior scrubbed clean and polished until it gleamed. Into this he ordered milk to be poured, drawn fresh each morning until the vessel was full. To outsiders, the family explained the milk was for butter and cheese, a symbol of their abundance. But in truth, it was to become Eleanor's shroud. The judge believed milk was the substance of life, and to drown her in it was to erase her from life while pretending to nourish it. He convinced himself that the ritual would purify the bloodline, dissolving her difference into nothingness. Eleanor was lowered into the barrel, her frail body swallowed by the pale liquid. She thrashed at first, her arms striking the iron walls, her muffled screams breaking the cellar's silence. The milk seeped into her nose, her mouth, her wounds, until her skin began to swell, to soften, to slough away. The family stood around the barrel as if in prayer, their faces calm, their hands folded, while Eleanor's body writhed in the white froth. Charles recorded the changes with detached precision, timing each convulsion, each gasp, until at last her movements stilled. What floated in the barrel was no longer a child, but a pale husk, her skin peeling in strips that curled in the liquid like petals. Her death was announced as illness. The family spoke of fever, of frailty, of a tragedy too common in those years. No grave was ever marked, no coffin carried to the churchyard. But whispers began to rise among the townsfolk. Servants spoke of the cries that had echoed through the house, of the barrel that had been rolled out in the night, heavy and dripping. Neighbors wondered why no doctor had been called, why Eleanor had never been seen in public before her sudden disappearance. The judge's reputation shielded him from open accusation, but unease lingered in the air. The house on the hill was admired, yet spoken of in hushed tones as though its bright windows concealed something unholy. Within the family, Eleanor's absence did not bring peace. It left an imprint, a wound that spread like infection. Her siblings whispered her name in fear, claiming to see her reflection in mirrors, to hear her voice in the hall at night, broken and wet like words spoken through milk. Charles wrote in his journals of strange occurrences in the cellar, candles extinguishing without cause, jars of preserved organs found shattered on the floor, and the sound of scratching against the iron barrel, though it had long since been emptied. To some in the family, Eleanor had become more powerful in death than in life. Her silence turned into haunting. William Davenport did not speak of her again, but his eyes betrayed him. He grew more severe, more desperate to erase weakness, as if Eleanor's image still lingered at the edges of his vision. Her death had not cleansed him. It had deepened his obsession. The family carried on with their rituals, their cellar filling with new cries, but Eleanor remained a ghost in their legacy. A child erased yet never forgotten. The milk that had been meant to purify had instead curdled into memory, sour and unyielding. And so the Davenport house stood, its walls outwardly bright, but beneath a barrel of iron sat rusting in the dark, its stench never truly fading. Eleanor's disappearance became a turning point, not only in the cellar's rituals but in the family's psyche. Her death proved that cruelty was not only tradition but obsession, a hunger that could never be satisfied. When Judge William Davenport died in 1850, his family gathered to mourn a man the world believed to be the embodiment of justice. His funeral was attended by governors, lawyers, and men who spoke of his fairness, his dedication to law, his defense of order in a young and fractured state. They praised his wisdom, his dignity, his unwavering morality. The house on the hill was draped in black, its windows shuttered in respect. But even as the mourners departed, leaving their words of praise behind, the house itself seemed restless, as though the death of its master had loosened something buried within its foundations. It was not grief that haunted the estate, but discovery. Behind the cellar wall, Hidden behind a panel of stone sealed with mortar, a collection of journals and ledgers was uncovered. They were not diaries filled with sentiment or reflection. They were records, precise and meticulous, written in the same hand that had once signed court rulings and judgments. Bound in leather, the pages carried the weight of authority, their language cold and exact, as though the deaths catalogued within them were not acts of cruelty but rulings in a private court. Each child was recorded as if they were a case, their flaws listed like charges, their punishments described in careful detail. Names, dates, and methods were inscribed without hesitation. Some entries were short, noting only that an infant was deemed unfit and removed. Others stretched across pages, chronicling weeks of starvation, mutilation, or madness. There was no remorse in these words, no recognition of humanity. Each death was written as an inevitable conclusion, a verdict carried out with precision. To William Davenport, the cellar had not been a chamber of horror, but a court of silence where he ruled as judge, jury, and executioner. Among the most chilling entries were those labeled "The Drowning of the Lambs." These described a ritual repeated many times, in which newborns considered unworthy were submerged into clay basins filled with rainwater. The family gathered around, reciting psalms as the infants gasped and flailed, their tiny fists striking against the basin's sides. The words of Scripture were spoken not as comfort but as a rhythm to drown by, each verse marking another moment until the water stilled. The judge wrote of these deaths as if they were holy acts purifying the family's bloodline. He even noted the sounds the infants made, calling them the last bleating of lambs before silence. Other entries revealed the precision of Charles Davenport's experiments. He documented the chamber of glass with pride, describing how starvation and reflection broke the mind, how children turned against their own bodies when faced with warped images of themselves. He recorded the number of days each child lasted, the wounds they inflicted upon themselves, the exact hour of their deaths. These were not the words of a grieving brother, but of a man who saw suffering as data, each life reduced to an experiment completed. As the journals were read, it became clear that the cellar had been more than a secret. It had been an institution of cruelty, upheld by ritual, preserved by record, passed down through generations like a legal code. Every method was catalogued, every death explained, every silence justified. What the world saw as the dignity of a judge was revealed in those pages as the cold cruelty of a man who believed law could be written not only on paper but on flesh. When the records reached the hands of the authorities, they were stunned into silence. The Davenports were too powerful, too respected. Their influence spread through every corner of the state. To expose the truth would unravel not only a family, but an entire structure of power built upon their reputation. And so the decision was made to seal the records. They were locked away under state order, never to be spoken of publicly, hidden in archives where dust would cover them and time would dull their memory. The deaths catalogued within were erased not only from the Davenport name, but from the knowledge of the world. Yet silence could not erase the weight of those words. Servants who had glimpsed the journals whispered of what they had seen. Rumors spread of infants drowned in basins, of children mutilated in ritual silence, of experiments that turned siblings into executioners. The whispers carried into town, into church pews, into the conversations of neighbors who had long suspected that something unholy lived in the house on the hill. Though the state buried the records, the people carried the unease. The legacy of the Davenports could not be sealed entirely, for the cellar itself remained heavy with the memory of every name inscribed in those books. For the heirs who survived, the journals became both curse and instruction. Some saw them as sacred texts, proof that their lineage was bound by order, that their cruelty was not madness but inheritance. Others trembled at the weight of what they revealed, haunted by the knowledge that their family's greatness was built on a foundation of children's bones. In either case, the journals shaped them, binding them deeper to the cellar's silence. The records ensured that even in death, William Davenport's hand continued to guide the family, his rulings carved not only into paper but into blood and memory. And so, as the shutters of the house were reopened and the mourning black was lifted, the legacy of the judge endured not in praise but in secrecy. The journals remained locked away, their words hidden from history, yet the cellar still breathed, still whispered, still demanded. The silence that had been cultivated for generations did not end with the sealing of those books. It deepened, settling into the soil, into the walls, into the very air of the house on the hill, waiting for the next chapter to be written in flesh. Years passed after the death of Judge William Davenport, and the white columns of the house on the hill began to rot. The shutters cracked, weeds rose against the stone foundation, and the once proud estate slipped into ruin. By the time of Reconstruction, the house was no longer a symbol of order but a hollowed monument to silence. Its grandeur had faded, but its cellar endured, sealed in the soil beneath like a wound the earth refused to heal. When the estate was finally abandoned and sold off, its walls broken open by new owners and workmen, the cellar revealed what the family had buried for generations. Beneath the damp stones lay skeletal remains, dozens of them piled in corners, sealed in shallow pits, stuffed into barrels long since rusted through. Tiny bones with jaws too small to have ever spoken, ribs curled inward as though still caving under starvation, skulls marked by fractures that told of deliberate blows. Some skeletons bore the scars of mutilation, teeth broken, ear canals scarred, tongues cut from their roots. Others showed signs of slow death, bones thin and porous from starvation, joints fused by rickets that had been allowed to rot unchecked. It was not a single crime unearthed, but a ledger of horror, written in bone rather than ink. The discovery did not reach the newspapers with the force it should have. The family's reputation still shielded them, even in ruin. Officials debated what to say, how much could be revealed, whether exposing the truth would stain not only the Davenport name but the very trust in institutions of law and power. The ledgers found earlier, those unsealed confessions, were quietly tied to the bones now brought into light. Some officials urged for silence once again, fearing the shock such revelations would bring to a state still raw from war and division. But the cellar had made silence impossible. Its remains told their own story. Whispers spread through Kentucky and beyond of what had been found. Neighbors spoke of the cries they had once heard, the strange disappearances, the unease that had clung to the house for decades. Now their suspicions had been given proof, unearthed in the skeletal remains of children who had never been mourned, never buried in churchyards, never given names outside of ledgers. The horror became part of the region's shadow history, spoken of in hushed voices but never fully acknowledged in public halls. The Davenports became a name people avoided, their descendants fleeing or changing their surnames, trying to distance themselves from the cellar's curse. Yet even silence left an imprint. The discovery of the bones stirred early conversations about the need to protect children from the unchecked power of families and institutions. Ministers began to preach about the sin of secrecy. Lawmakers debated the rights of children in ways that had never been done before. It was said, though rarely written, that the Davenport case was whispered in those early discussions of laws that would later demand guardianship, oversight, and protection. The horror of the cellar had forced society to see that cruelty could thrive in the places most trusted, hidden beneath the mask of civility. But history is not shaped by law alone. The bones that were unearthed were never given proper graves. Many were reburied quietly without markers, sealed again in silence so that the shame of their discovery would not linger in public memory. Families who had once admired the judge closed their doors when his name was mentioned. Churches chose not to hold services for the souls that had been discarded beneath his house. The children remained anonymous, their stories carried only in whispers in the ghost tales told by locals who swore the house was haunted long after it collapsed into ruin. The legacy of the Davenport cellar was not only in the bones it left behind, but in the silence it created. It proved that evil does not always shout or rage. More often it whispers, cloaks itself in order, wears the mask of respectability. William Davenport was not remembered by his neighbors as a madman foaming at the mouth, but as a judge who spoke with calm, steady authority. His cruelty was methodical, hidden behind sermons and law, passed down as ritual, protected by silence. And in that silence it thrived. For the descendants of the family, the shadow never lifted. Some tried to justify what had been done, calling it discipline, purity, strength. Others fled from it, haunted by the idea that their own blood carried the same capacity for cruelty. The cellar became not only a physical ruin, but a symbol of how violence can be inherited, how tradition can disguise atrocity, how the darkest rituals are often carried out behind doors painted with innocence. In the end, the Davenport story is not just about one family or one cellar. It is about the way evil operates in silence. It does not always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like order, like law, like a house with white columns on a hill. Sometimes it looks like a father teaching his son, or a doctor carrying his instruments, or a child obeying without question. It hides in places no one wishes to look, in families too powerful to question, in institutions too trusted to doubt. The bones found beneath the Davenport estate remain unmarked, but their legacy lives in the shadows of laws and whispers of conscience. They remind us that cruelty is not always loud, not always obvious. It is patient, methodical, and it waits in silence until it is uncovered. And so the question remains, what do you think? Could this happen again? Could silence still protect horrors in houses that appear perfect from the outside, in families that wear respectability like armor? The cellar may have collapsed into dust, but the lesson it left endures. That evil does not need madness to survive. It only needs silence.